Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Ledbetter. I am head of people and platform at Boldstart Ventures. We want to welcome all of you to the first of what we hope will be a series of discussions with enterprise CXOs about the ways in which we are adapting and they are adapting and in some cases changing course due to the impact of this global pandemic. Kicking us off are two technology execs and close friends of Boldstart, CTO of Priceline, Marty Brodbeck, and Dean Del Vecchio, EVP, CIO, and Chief of Operations at Guardian Life Insurance. And today we'll be diving into the impacts of COVID-19 on their digital transformations thus far. I want to begin by introducing Ed Sim, who will moderate the discussion, our founder and managing partner of Boldstart Ventures, a day one first check partner and true believer in enterprise infrastructure and SaaS founders. Boldstart's often the first investor working closely with technical founders at company formation. Notable first check investments include Sneak, Customer, Big ID, Superhuman, Security Scorecard, Front, and Fortress IQ. Ed previously co-founded Dawn Trader Ventures, where he led first round investments in LivePerson, GoToMeeting, and Greenplum, which became Pivotal Software. Ed founded Boldstart in 2010 with Elliot Durbin, and the firm now has 8 team members. Before I pass it along to Ed, we'd like to just get a feel for our audience. So let's start with a poll. We'd like to know who is joining the webinar today. So we will launch the poll now. Please go ahead and add in, there we go. Great. I'm gonna go ahead and leave this for about 10 seconds. All right, we're gonna wrap in 5. Okay, we'll go ahead and end now. So it looks like we have a good mix of mostly investors, enterprise employees, and founders of software companies. So very exciting. All right, Ed, I'm gonna let you go ahead and take it from here. So go on ahead.
Awesome. Hey, Natalie, thank you for the great introduction. I'm Ed with Boldstart. I'll be moderating today. And we'll begin with a discussion with our panelists and move into questions from the audience during the last 10 minutes of the event. Please submit your questions as they arise, and we'll do our best to get to those during Q&A. I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves first. So let's begin with Dean to kick this off.
Okay, thanks, Ed. So Dean Del Vecchio, as mentioned, I'm the CIO and Chief of Operations for Guardian Life. And that's kind of a combination of functions that you normally don't see on the operations side. So, including all of the technology, development, infrastructure, and all those things, it's real estate, it's sourcing, it's facilities, it's procurement, it's physical security, it's Guardian India, and all new business and operations for the company. So I've been there for about going on 7 years. Prior to that, it was Dow Jones CIO and Chief Administrative Officer at News Corp, and other hosts have functions prior to that in the financial industries.
Marty, you want to kick us off as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ed. Marty Brodbeck, CTO at Priceline. I'm responsible for product engineering, infrastructure, software development. Prior to that, was the CTO at Shutterstock, and also held CTO positions at Pfizer and Diageo. Excited to be here and with Dean to talk about the transformation our company's under and the impact COVID-19's had on us.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for participating. I just love how this highlights also the strength of New York as an enterprise IT community that sometimes people forget. So let me start off with the first question here before we get into digital transformation. Business continuity. Some of us may have experienced this during September 11th or Hurricane Sandy, but I'd love for each of you to talk about, maybe starting with Dean, talk about how you go from operating at full kind of cycle, just the regular way, and then how do you go overnight and go remote? I'd love to hear kind of your thinking around that.
Yeah, great. And I guess I'll key off of, since you mentioned Superstorm Sandy, I joined Guardian right after Superstorm Sandy, and they weren't as well prepared for that event as we were now for this one that we're all experiencing right now. And I say that because they really didn't have a great business continuity plan in place. Through heroics and through great efforts, they got themselves through that. but it was through a lot of, people, doing things, unnatural things to get them back up and running. Since that time, they made a commitment, and we've made investments over the past several years, bolstering up our infrastructure, creating, a capability for basically the entire organization to work from home at any given point. We made a decision to migrate to the cloud. We were early adopters of the public cloud, so we didn't really have to worry about our data center, our facilities during this crisis to get people in there and critical staff, for example. And we made a decision on March 10th to test the infrastructure to see if the entire company could work from home. Now, with all that said, we did have a very robust work at home program where on average, Guardian had about 50% of our population working from home at any given point, 1 to 2 days a week. So the test wasn't really to find out if that was going to work, the infrastructure was going to work. It was for the individuals that normally didn't work from home. So as part of Superstorm Sandy as well, we made a decision that we'd get laptops for every employee in the company, regardless if they were a normal work at home user or participant. So on the 10th, we made a decision. Everybody went to work from home, and we never looked back. It was a seamless transition. People brought their laptops home, plugged in, and we're up and running. So we really haven't lost a beat in this process, as going from a 50% people taking advantage of it to an entire organization, 9,000 plus employees working from home basically in one day.
That's awesome. How about Marty? Any thoughts to add here?
It was bring your laptop home and let's get going. So we were fortunate enough, we made investments over the last couple of years around developer productivity, telecommunications, teleconferencing, video conferencing, as well as collaboration. So for us, it was really just ensuring we had the right level of capacity to support everybody. And it was basically turn the key. And, starting in middle of March, we haven't looked back. Everybody's been working home pretty flawlessly. So for us, similar to Dean, we've been making these investments over the last couple of years, and it was the best business continuity test ever, just having everybody go home, and, it worked out really well for us. So we haven't seen any productivity loss from our engineering organization at all.
That's awesome. I have one more question to ask around kind of continuity. What has gotten harder in the transition to remote work? I know, physically and technologically, it was, you flipped the switch for both of you, and what is easier than expected? I'd be curious just to kind of hear what you're learning so far.
I think, for us, sometimes it's the ad hoc collaboration where you're together in an office and you have an idea and you want to run over to somebody to talk to them about it. So, product engineering is sometimes spontaneity within the office where you could be walking or having a cup of coffee with somebody and then you spark an idea, and there's that natural creative collaboration that happens when you're working together. At home, it's a little bit different. If you have an idea in your head and you want to collaborate with someone, you have to Slack or Zoom them to get on a meeting. So for us, like sprint zero planning, where you're working through architecture or design, has to be much more deliberate than sometimes the spontaneity that happens within an office environment where you're co-collaborating with your product folks.
Awesome. How about you, Dean? Anything to add there?
Yeah, so I would add similar, but the one area what I've seen people in the adoption of the technology now more than ever. So as I mentioned, we had a fairly robust work at home population, but for the people who didn't work at home, watching them adopt the technology so quickly now, where they're leveraging, whether it's video conferencing, whether it's, sharing screens, and just using the technology that was taking us a little bit of a while to get people to adopt now happened overnight. And we're actually seeing, Mark, to your challenge, we're actually seeing teams create open Skype meetings so they can have that kind of walk-by collaboration concept where maybe they haven't had in the past, missing it from the human interaction, having those flyby type discussions that we all get, and innovation happens. But it was really the quick pickup of the adoption of really leveraging the collaboration tools that we've implemented now more broadly across the organization was quite surprising.
I think it's awesome. I mean, I keep thinking sometimes if this happened, 10 or 15 years ago, how much different kind of all of us would be answering these questions from a productivity perspective. And it leads me to start thinking about what Satya Nadella said regarding his Q1 earnings. He said that he saw 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months in Q1. And with both of you here, I know that you've always been forward thinking and have already kind of moved to the cloud. I'd be curious, are you kind of seeing this acceleration on your side in terms of projects that you're working on, or, are things on pause? How would you answer that? And I'll let Marty kick that off.
We've continued with our strategy around our digital strategy. Nothing's really changed. In fact, I think we're more focused than ever on really developer productivity. And so we've doubled down on modernizing our CI/CD pipeline, accelerating the move of our applications to 12-factor based architectures, accelerated our move to Kubernetes. And now more than ever, since all of our engineers are remote, we really want to make sure that our developers are having the best engineering experience possible from their homes. So we've looked to continue and actually accelerate certain things that we weren't necessarily accelerating prior to COVID-19.
Awesome. How about you, Dean? I know you've had developer productivity platforms, and be curious how you would think about that.
Yeah, I would say most of the same things that we just mentioned, but the area that we're really focused on and obsessed about now more than ever, I would say, is just the overall digital consumer experience. We've been on a journey the past couple of years, and we've made a commitment to provide this kind of effortless, kind of seamless, delightful experience for our consumers. And the area that we're really accelerating. So from a strategy perspective, I would say we've stayed true to it. The one area that we've accelerated is the AI and automation piece of it. There's things that we've been able to do in weeks as opposed to months now in terms of, putting out to the market. Example would be we just put out a digital agent from IPsoft, for example, Amelia, that we made available to our plan holders and directly access to it within weeks. And like I said, that may have taken months in the past to get through the hurdles of whether it was compliance or what have you. We still went through it, but the decisions are being made so much quicker now. We're seeing the level of collaboration and a sense of urgency like we've never seen before. So it's been really healthy and allowing us to accelerate some of our digital programs.
That is awesome. It's pretty funny. I was looking at and listening to kind of an earnings release and heard that Barilla, the pasta maker, was going direct online and actually building out like a Shopify store. Yeah. So, Marty, I know that you've always been online pretty much with Priceline. Are there any things that you're doing to make the consumer experience better, faster? It seems to me that, we're going to rely on digital more and more these days, particularly as we don't know kind of when a vaccine may come back.
Yeah, we're spending a lot of time automating our continuous deployment pipeline. Priceline has always been a company that has prided itself on pushing out more products and features for our consumers. We wanted to accelerate the automation around that in a more logical way. So we've been investing a lot of our time in canary deploys and actually automating the build of our GCP environments using a Kubernetes blueprint and enabling our developers to, once they get through a build cycle, to seamlessly deploy it, run a smoke test, deploy it into a canary environment, and actually look at the performance before and after that deployment, and have the ability to automate the rollback if the code doesn't pass certain thresholds, or actually push the canary deploy out to more servers after it bakes. So for us, we want to get to a point within our software development pipeline where it's a single push button that automates the design, development, and deployment of code at scale across any GCP region that we run across our environment today. So we're super focused on how we can push features and functions out at a much more accelerated pace than we already do today.
How far along in your journey, percent-wise, do you think you are right now?
We've been working on the automated new CD platform now for about 4 months. It's going well. I would say we've got about 35 to 40% of our environment on that. We are now moving to GitHub as our core mono repo repository for all of our projects. We're about 45% of the way migrated there. And we're accelerating our move to GCP. We're currently building out a couple major regions around the world around that. And I would say we'd be a good 40% of the way there by the end of the year is our target goal. So all in all, I would say aggressive push forward around those things. We're also investing a lot of time in decoupling our GCP regions from our data centers using technology from Istio to do that. So.
Got it. How about you, Dean? Are you what kinds of things are you working on?
Yeah,
The
so
productivity
as you know, we've talked about it in the past. We created our own internal kind of, automation and tools with what we call Launchpad to help us do basically a lot of the things you just mentioned, Martin, right? To help do the auto deployment and the orchestration of all of those pieces and functions to try to focus on getting our developers to spend more time with hands-on keyboard as opposed to worrying about the process aspects of everything and putting in the appropriate change requests and forms and all that, and trying to automate as much as possible, but also with keeping in mind, security is we're a highly regulated industry as you are as well, but to make sure that we've covered all of those kind of control points as well in the process. So automating it and building it and taking out a lot of the manual reviews and putting that built into the process to do a fully automated deployment, satisfying all of our compliance controls that are required. The other area too, I would just talk about it that I didn't mention, from a customer perspective, we're looking to try to digitize the whole supply chain. So when you think about our businesses, and especially on the life side of the house, there's a lot of manual interventions and handoffs. And we've been really aggressive at automating the whole e-app, e-delivery, e-meds, e-signature, e-policy of the entire process, and working with some startups as well to try to figure out how can we get to kind of a fluidless, automated or accelerated underwriting process. And we've actually made tremendous progress over the last year or so in doing just that. So we've got about 70+% of now of our policies are fully automated from a e-delivery policy, or I should say fully digitized, not fully automated, but full digital experience now, where in the past, there was a lot of human intervention.
I think both of you are pretty interesting because I know that there's a lot of building happening there. You have a lot of software engineers, a lot of knowledge technically. How do you actually go about the build versus buy decision, in terms of a new application that you're deciding to launch or a new problem you're trying to solve? Kind of what goes into that process, and has anything changed because of kind of the current pandemic we're in? I mean, maybe Marty, you can hit that first.
Yeah, I think we always evaluate build versus buy versus what's our core competency and what's not. I mean, we're an e-commerce company, so our user experience and experimentation and product features that we develop for the travel industry is where our bread and butter is, and we focus a lot on that, and that's where we do a lot of our development in-house. I would say for CI/CD pipeline and our transformation on that, there's a lot of best in breed tools out there that we would much rather buy than build, particularly around the software ecosystem. I wouldn't advocate for buying one platform for everything, but there's a good connected set of tools that you can actually purchase that really automate your time to delivery around software. And also in the infrastructure space, there are core capabilities that we build that are specific to our e-commerce environment, but there's a lot of best in breed tools out there, particularly in the cloud space, that I would highly recommend companies look at in the startup space and in the more mature space to manage and automate the management of your cloud infrastructure. So, and then also it's also the total cost of ownership if you build something. Usually if you build something in-house, you got to take into account also the support and operations of that homegrown software and the brain leakage that occurs when people leave the company and you have to maintain it over time. So we try to balance both of those kind of items pretty carefully within our environment.
Awesome. How about you, Dean?
Yeah, we take a pretty simplistic approach to it. We build things that we think are going to be differentiators for us in the market and in terms of something that we can do differently than our competitors. And we buy things that are commodity. Some of the things we have built that may seem commodities only because nobody's actually built it yet. So I wish somebody would have built that fully orchestrated system for us that satisfied all of the compliance requirements we have with all the different regulatory agencies we deal with, but they haven't. That's the only reason why we built that. We didn't think it was a competitive advantage, but that's how we look at it. Very simple. Buy what's commodity, build what's differentiating.
Awesome. So one question I have as you think about the world that we're in today, do you have any viewpoint on cloud versus multi-cloud in terms of, I know that Marty, you're in GCP, Dean, you're in AWS. Has this kind of pandemic forced you to rethink things, or are you still on track just kind of with your original thinking around that topic?
I would say, like, so we're 12 factor first. So when we build or architect any application moving forward, it has to conform to the 12 factor architecture principles that would allow us to move our compute workloads around to any cloud environment. So in our case, we're running our compute environment in GCP, but also we're running our telephony system in AWS. So I think on the compute side, we're standardizing around 12 factor to give ourselves much more flexibility when there will be a point when you have to do infrastructure arbitrage between different cloud providers that will have some flexibility around that. On the data side, it's a little bit different because data is a little bit harder to migrate workloads in and out of cloud environments, just the way in which the cloud vendors actually architect some of their data platforms. So we're much more conscious of how we construct our data environments to be as simplistic as possible, so that when we do have to make moves, they can be much less painful than when you switch actually provider.
Awesome.
Yeah, for us, I would say I answer this question in a couple of different ways. One is we made a very conscious decision early on when we went with AWS from a platform and from a data platform perspective to go with them and get all the muscle memory. And as I mentioned earlier, being a highly regulated industry, we spent about a year preparing that environment to make sure that we can operate and move production workloads there, and took a very aggressive approach to do that, but a very mindful one. But from a multi-cloud perspective, we're already, we're a Workday environment, we're an Oracle environment, we're a Salesforce environment, we're an Office 365. We're already a multi-cloud environment when you think about it, right? We've just made a conscious decision from a platform perspective, again, from a muscle memory, from a scale, and from an expediency perspective, to go with AWS. But we do have plans to reevaluate, a true multi-cloud. Will I design applications that run in multi-clouds? Maybe, maybe not. I got to look at the total cost of ownership, because there is a total cost of ownership to do that. Or does it make sense to run certain applications in certain clouds to give you that diversity based on your portfolio? And that's how we're looking at it.
Awesome. Dean, I have another question for you. Let's switch gears for a second to security.
Sure.
Now you have 5,000 plus employees working from home. Have you had to kind of push up any new priorities from the security perspective? Back in the day, it used to be kind of that M&M model with the hard, crunchy outer shell and then kind of, endpoint security focus. But today it seems like it's a borderless world. And how should people think about security, and what things are top of mind for you?
Yeah, again, so it hasn't really changed. It's actually 9,000 employees working from home, but it was on average 5,000 employees on a weekly basis. So again, our architecture, our platforms, our infrastructure, the way we approach the security and compliance hasn't changed. We were constantly always in that mode. It's always been a heightened area of focus for us, again, based on the industry we operate in. So it really wasn't a change. As Martin said earlier too, right? We flipped the switch and people work from home. It's the same security requirements, the same monitoring, supervision, controls, everything that we've had, prior to COVID-19. Nothing's changed for us from that perspective.
How about you, Marty? Anything new for you on the security side or top of mind?
Yeah, I think we've accelerated our security architecture review on how we're going to secure container and Kubernetes workloads in the cloud. So that work we've accelerated because we want to get more and more of our estate into that. And I think the second thing is really security around GitHub and analyzing, if you have everything consolidated in a mono repo, how are user policies and access controls actually structured from a security perspective to maximize the protection of your code base and ensure your developers are minimizing their exposure to any security threat. So I think we've taken a fresh look at how, based on the modernization and the cloudification of the CI/CD pipeline, how we're going to put security controls in place from design through production.
That's awesome. So I had a question just got thrown up in the middle of all this. Someone was asking, what tools do you use to track productivity of your teams right now? Or what are some measures you've taken to improve your team's productivity? I know with both of you, we've had some conversations in the past about how you may feel like the world is more productive than ever, but would love to hear your thoughts around that for some of the people in the audience.
So I could jump in just real quick. You know, we've adopted this Safe Agile framework over the last probably 2.5 years, somewhat religiously. So we have quite a bit of, and when I say religiously, we're still doing Scrum for Scrums, and we're doing, you know, Kanban boards and all of that type of stuff, but we're appropriate. But we're looking at it from a productivity. One is, you know, obviously the backlog, you know, the code that's produced, and you know, without causing errors, the amount of code we're producing and releases that we do, and are the releases on time? Are they delivering what's expected and then release? So just from a true development perspective, we're seeing productivity improvements. We're pumping out more releases, more code with less errors and more higher quality. And then just the backlog, right? Draining that backlog across the board of all of these, you know, we've got 17 trains running, anywhere from 2,000 people at any given point, you know, working on product delivery and releasing new code. So we're measuring it from that perspective on kind of the delivery side. On my operations side, it's all about, you know, the satisfaction, customer ease of engagement scores, customer sat scores, obviously net promoter scores, but we're really focused on the customer ease of doing business and customer sat scores in terms of are we producing better quality and delivering better results for our consumers at the end of the day. That's what really matters, is are they getting what they need faster, sooner, quicker type stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. How about you, Marty?
Yeah, we're agile using Scrum, so we track points committed versus points delivered, quality of releases, time to market, churn, etc. And one of my prior lives as CTO, we started building out an automated system from a company called PinPT that actually provided end-to-end productivity measurements for engineering, which was fantastic because you could look at the value and productivity of every engineer in your organization. And in certain cases, again, in my prior lives, we saw that some of our best engineers were from our associates or mid-level engineers versus some of our senior engineers. So today we're building out a full end-to-end framework around that. We look at our software development process as kind of one of the most mission critical processes within the company, and figuring out ways in which we can automate metrics around that: code committed versus code deployed, quality of code, time to market, story points committed versus delivered, churn. Churn within the sprint's a big one because that measures productivity of product managers and how good their epics and user stories are. So we have a framework around that, but I would also encourage people on this call to look at some of the software that's evolving in this space from companies like PinPT and others that have really, you know, fantastic solutions for measuring that process end to end.
Well, thank you, Marty. Pinpoint is one of ours portfolio companies. So for anyone out there thinking about it, and the cool part is though, they actually started going more from the top down to providing more value for the individual developer and teams actually doing work. So I think that's a great segue regarding startups. You know, if you look back at history in the recession times, people are worried about cost. And there's always this argument around best of breed. Do I go out and get 4 or 5 best of breed, you know, pieces of software for my stack, or do you go after one throat to choke? And I'd be curious, kind of given the tough times that we're all living in, how do you think about that, and how do you balance kind of cost with innovation? Maybe Dean, you can hit that one first.
Yeah, so as you know, we're constantly looking in the market and participating in, you know, different types of startup investments. You know, we have a group within Guardian that I'm part of the board of, is Guardian Strategic Ventures, and we're looking at fintechs, infotech, and short tech companies all the time on where they can add value and where maybe we could just learn from. So we'll participate in some of these investments purely from, you know, obviously we want to see a good financial return, but more importantly, we want to gain access to people and maybe technologies that we normally wouldn't be able to see or get you know, eyes onto, or influence for that matter. And then lastly, we like to try to do, if we can, a co-dev opportunity with these startups to fill pockets of our supply chain, pockets of our experiences. So we're always looking for new things. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, Human API is one of the investments we made on the, you know, the life side of the house, and WorkFusion is another example of a company that we invested in on how they can help us from a smart automation perspective, right? So it's a constant view for us. We're constantly looking for ways to innovate and improve, whether it's internal processes, our employees, productivity, or externally our customer experience and how they engage with us.
I think that's awesome, and it kind of speaks to what we've talked about in the past about enterprise design partnerships, where early stage startups should not be trying to sell to you if they're super early, but figure out A, how to solve your problem, and B is how to partner with you and take that approach. And I think you just highlighted kind of that.
Yeah, I think the case study approach as opposed to enterprise licensing approach is the type of partners we're looking to get more engaged with and do point case study solutions and then graduate and grow the relationship.
Awesome. How about you, Marty?
We look for partnerships and building great products. And, whether that's, a startup or enterprise software company, most of the times that winds up being a startup. So for us, speed, anything that can, enhance our customer experience, build out our platform, drive more, incremental bookings on our website, bring more stability to our infrastructure, drive down costs. We're always open to partner with startups and software companies. We've done a lot of partnerships in the past where we co-develop a product with a company, or we partner very closely on building out the first version of their product. That's been kind of the DNA of a Priceline for a long time, because we were once a startup. In some cases, I view our company as still an enterprise-wide startup where innovation is in the DNA of what we do, and we're always open to learning from the ecosystem for particular items that we're looking to develop. So continuous learning is always important for an engineering organization. Once you stop learning, the organization becomes stale, or thinking that you have all the answers to the problems internally. So similar to, drug discovery and drug development, technology is no different. And we continuously partner with startups around opportunities where they can help us advance our business and create a good partnership and experience for our customers.
Thank you. You both nailed it, which is why I'm so excited about kind of being in New York. People always ask us, how do you invest in enterprise startups, on day one in New York? And my answer is because I have folks like you to talk to about who are willing to actually take some risks and partner with startups early in the life cycle. And I think just building that continuous ecosystem is pretty awesome. Let's switch gears for a second before we hit Q&A. So none of us are experts in terms of what this pandemic looks like, but how do you think about what getting back to work looks like? Like, what will kind of a new normal look like? How are you preparing for it? I mean, most people think that this whole remote work scenario will be completely accelerated with, kind of hybrid environments, teams in the next few years, but I'd love to hear both your thoughts around that.
I think that, this is kind of the new, and no one knows what the new normal is going to look like. What I do know is that as a leader, what you have to do is the following. Number one, build out a set of capabilities for your engineering organization where they can be the most productive that they can from any location around the world. That's the first thing. Second thing is to make sure that you continue to have the right balance of work and play, or work and home life. Now they're commingled together. So as a leader, you have to ensure that your teams are having the right balance. I think the third piece is making sure you stay connected now more than ever with everybody on your team. We do daily stand-ups. We have, a once a week happy hour where everybody gets together. We're having a virtual hackathon in a couple weeks. So, the new normal is what we are doing right now. And, for us, it's continuing down the journey of just making sure that we can maximize every individual in our organization and giving them the right set of capabilities for them to be successful.
Awesome. How about you, Dean?
Yeah, so some of the similar things, I would say the area that we're really focused on now, is that point of, are people working too much, right? We've, as many of you may have seen the study that went out last week, I think they said the average person is working, 3 hours or more a day than they did in the past. So I think many of us, when you ask the question, how are we seeing productivity? We're seeing higher productivity in this model right now, but we're also seeing the potential people verge of burnout. So we're really focused on now the well-being of our employees. To your point, Marty, like we're doing weekly videos from the leadership teams, whether they're 2-minute clips or whatever, focusing on, again, this month is, staying mindful, providing them with tools and capabilities on just how to, what do you do to take a break or do a staycation, right? Influencing people to take PTO, even though maybe you can't go on a vacation, but just to get that downtime and rejuvenate, spend time with your family, your partner, or whoever, just to get some of that, downtime to not just work constantly. I find myself in this room that you see me in now more than I've ever been in my life. And the next day runs into the next day that runs into the next day. And I think we've just got to be mindful of that and make sure people are being aware of the time they're spending, working and getting that kind of, work-life balance. It's critical, I think, to what's going on. So we're doing all the same things as everybody else, doing the weekly kind of happy hours and staying connected, doing 15-minute stand-ups as a leadership team every morning just to touch base. But I think now, like I said, our big focus is on what is it that we can do for our employees to help them stay healthy and mindful of their own health. And then going back, like you said, I don't know if there is a new normal, but we're not planning on going back anytime soon. And when we do go back, we're going to make sure that our environments are safe, that it's going to be an individual decision for each employee based on their own circumstances. And it's not going to be something that we're going to force people to go back into an environment if they personally don't feel safe, even though the rest of the company does.
That is awesome. Yeah, I mean, we feel the same way ourselves here. Is we're not going back to work anytime soon, and virtual actually is working for us quite well. Yep. Related to this, I have a question for you from the audience. Has the pandemic caused either of you to pull back on current or planned IT projects in the near term at all? Why or why not? Which is an interesting question, I guess. Would love your thoughts on that.
I think there's 1 or 2 projects that we had to slow down just based on, COVID-19. But by and large, our technology strategy that we actually put in place in December of this year, we're continuing with a lot of those strategies. I think we had a pretty significant push to the cloud this year, the modernization of our CI/CD pipeline. We had a pretty significant data transformation project underway. So I think the key ones, I think we've pushed forward with. There's a couple, to be honest with you, because they were just going to take an enormous amount of time working remotely that we've delayed or pushed out a little bit.
Yeah, for us, we haven't veered off our strategy by any means. What we may have done a little bit is just reprioritize some things. We may have, like I said, we're accelerating some of the digital programs that we had in place that maybe we were going to do at the latter part of the year. We moved them up to the early part of the year. But we have one of our most aggressive portfolios this year, and we're sticking with it.
That's awesome. Yeah, as I said, the reason I had both of you on here too is because I know you've been quite forward thinking, and we're already on the cloud, whereas some folks are still struggling to kind of get there. So we have a bunch of other questions here. One question we'd love to hear is, how do startups get your attention? Particularly with, I'm sure you have another email that comes in right now saying, hello, COVID-19, I've got some technology to help you solve some problems. Clearly you're not reading those. Clearly you're not looking at voicemails, but how does the startup get your attention? And has that changed at all kind of in this current kind of time frame?
No. No. Listen, I think what sets a startup apart is having a really great idea to solve a business problem, and that idea can solve several business problems. And so the people that I've partnered with in my career have always been people that understood my business and had a unique way to solve a problem, whether it was in the infrastructure or software engineering space. And COVID-19 hasn't changed that. In fact, when I get one of those COVID-19 kind of emails, it automatically probably goes into the delete bucket, because it's the same pitch from everybody versus startups in this space in particular. I've been through the internet bubble, 9/11, the financial crisis, and now COVID-19. And the one thing that has stayed the same is that smart people with smart ideas can solve big problems. And that kind of thesis is the foundation for a great software engineering culture that we try to build, but also applies for, startups. And financial conditions or, pandemics that we're going through don't really change that.
Love that. Dean, anything to add there?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I think you were spot on about, spend the time to understand our business. So when you come in, you could talk intelligently about the problems you think you're coming to try to solve. That's one of the things we find quite often is people really don't understand the business that we're in, and there's no applicability in some cases. So it's, put in the upfront time, a little effort goes a long way.
Awesome. And I'll have a follow-up question. Some of the folks were asking about, has the process of purchasing software changed at all because of this? For example, I've had some companies that were selling top down into organizations where the price points are pretty high, and they're like, hey, look, I need to get CEO sign off here, and we're working remote, things are taking longer. Whereas the companies that we have in our portfolio that are bottom up and brought in to the organization, whether it's a SaaS application where an individual uses it and expands the team, or even open source or developer solutions where it kind of spreads within the team. Curious if any process has changed at all, or it's still pretty much the same now.
No, I think that, go ahead, Dean. You want to take that one first?
The only thing I was going to say quickly was that, as I mentioned earlier, I think the one thing that would be helpful is the use case pricing versus enterprise pricing. If you're a startup trying to do an enterprise deal right now, it's going to take a longer time than it is to get a small use case pricing in place to just get off the ground and get in to demonstrate your abilities and your product.
So that would argue for the land and expand model, right? Which is much easier to kind of start with a small group to
again, trying to fix, a problem,
Yeah.
a business problem and a business need, as opposed to, there's still startups struggling out there with an enterprise licensing agreement as their pipeline model.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. Marty, how about you?
We basically, what we try to do is, time to value and price it based on, business use cases, solve a problem for us, and then, figure out how we can expand that use case. So, what Dean said is spot on. We never go into a relationship thinking about an enterprise deal. It's more about what's the breadth and depth of the problems that you can help us solve, and, go from there in terms of pricing, software.
Awesome. So I have a different question here. Are your contact, this is a completely a different one. Are your contact or call center employees also working from home now, and any challenges there? Especially if you have kind of an on-prem versus cloud contact center model. Just curious, I know both of you have pretty extensive kind of folks supporting customers.
Yeah, we had call center employees working remotely. It was part of our plan when we flipped the switch. So no real hiccups there. I think the only opportunity areas that we saw in our call center space is how we can improve the user experience for the contact folks within our software stack. So we've been spending a lot of time of taking a more product-centric focus to the call center platform that we have. But by and large, we were able to transition those people from our contact centers to home pretty seamlessly.
Awesome.
Yep.
Dean?
Same thing. The one area that we just had to help with was just get maybe some of them some extra screens at home, because navigating multiple screens on a laptop is you lose some productivity there.
Yeah.
But that was about it. All of our call center agents are working from home.
Cool. So here's another question. We're getting inundated with questions here, so it's a good sign.
Sure.
Outside of productivity software, are there any areas of IT spend that are accelerating? If not, what areas outside of productivity are you prioritizing? If you one of you want to hit that question.
So just imagine having a virtual knock where you have people that were usually co-located in a technology center within your office that had thousands of screens everywhere, and they could easily look at the health of what was going on with your infrastructure. So for us, I think the one area that we've focused on is to ensure reliability of operations and accelerating our spend around getting much richer metrics around application performance. So with solutions, like New Relic that we're deploying across our environment, with something like Harness as well, we want to provide greater clarity for our IT operations specialists about exactly what's going on in our data centers and our cloud platform. So I think one of the areas where we were doing it already, but it's just ensuring that we preserve that investment is really in the productivity of our IT operations folks, considering that they are working remotely.
How about you, Dean?
Again, for us, the area of real focus for us is in the automation and AI space, right? We've been really focusing on kind of UiPath as our kind of basic RPA capabilities and functions, and driving out a lot of the bots, just basic bots, work fusion from a kind of what we would say smart automation. And then on the AI kind of front, Amelia is the first one, but there may be others that we're looking to roll out. That's an area where we think there's going to be a tremendous amount of productivity gain across our customer experience channels, from a true omni-channel experience capability, which we're not there yet, but we're accelerating that in a big way.
So Dean, speaking of AI and automation, someone asked, both of you are both aggressively pursuing automation. Where does it begin and end in the stack, right? Does it start with customer facing first, and how far does that go deep into the stack? For example, IBM is pushing AI ops, like whatever that means, right? So just curious how you think about that. And, do you build this internally, or do you go for external tooling as well? Is that a combination?
So our goal is to provide a very personalized and detailed user experience for our customer, to the point where we can start individualizing product offerings over time. So in order to do that, you have to capture real-time data about what your customers are doing on your website. And then that data has to flow into potentially a streaming platform that learns about user behavior. You have to have the ability to train that user behavior, and then to pump that back in your website to start personalizing and recommending products. So a lot of that core set of AI and automation capabilities is a combination of in-house development and using software to do that. So from our perspective, it's a combination of the two, and it's part machine learning. But it's also part engineering, and able to really create a customer data platform where you're tracking, user events on your platform, but also enabling your customers to opt out as well, from a compliance perspective with GDPR guidelines and CCPA guidelines as well.
Awesome. How about you, Dean?
Yeah, so we're looking at it in a couple of different ways. One is just, as you mentioned, right, it's the data and the behind the scenes that's going to generate and make your AI and automation useful. So we've got a whole data architecture strategy to support our AI and automation initiatives, along with a whole API strategy, both internally facing APIs and externally. And then what we're really focused on is we do lean business cases for everything, in terms of just looking at, and that's how we're prioritizing. If there's more value and benefit to focus on something that's going to be a whisper agent for our agents, right, where it's not facing the customer, but it's helping our agents be more efficient and effective, and we think that's more value for the customer, we may do that one first. If it's something, like I mentioned, we just made available to the public because they can't get to a person, we'll accelerate those. So it's all based on a lean business case with a very structured foundation and architecture to support it.
Awesome. So the questions keep pouring in. I know we have 10 minutes left here. Here's one that just came in. Curious, with the co-development mindset, oftentimes this does not align with the VC timeline. Would you lean towards licensing or purchasing a product that's already in the market and proven already? Like, how do you make the choice between kind of, startup that has, 50 customers versus one that has, none, right? And so how do you kind of think about that?
0 or 50 doesn't really matter to me. It's more of a question of what's the opportunity for that startup to solve a key problem that we have within our environment. In certain cases, 0 customer is actually better, because you have a chance to shape and mold the product based on a set of requirements that comes from your company. So to me, there's no difference. It's more of, what's the problem that they're enabling us to solve, and what's the best way in which to do development around that to solve it. Any startup company that leads with a licensing conversation is a meeting that I leave within the first 10 minutes.
You nailed it. Awesome. How about you, Dean?
Yeah, I wouldn't add much. I was going to say, if it's not solving a business problem, I mean, that's the first thing. Is there something to solve as a value?
Yeah, that's so funny. Even when startups are pitching us, they so often talk about their technology, and you're still struggling to figure out what problem are you solving.
Yeah.
And I think both of you keep saying, "Hey, what problem are you solving? How are you doing it uniquely? And how are you doing it 10 times better or cheaper than everyone else out there?"
Also, the other thing, Ed, just to add, innovative Me Too solutions are always good as well. Sometimes you get within the startup space, a certain startup tries to corner the market and dictate terms. And so, having a better mousetrap as well, that's more scalable, more cost effective, more affordable is also a good idea. And so I think we also look for those ideas all the time as well.
Awesome. I'll ask one last question. It's probably a little more specific here, but around the security of your remote workforce, have you yet to experience any circumstance where automated identity access management has been especially key? Or do you envision that being a priority or need to enhance? Or are you happy with what you have in place? Examples, please. So that's a pretty detailed question, but if one of you wants to take that one, go for it.
Yeah, so we have federated identity already in place using Okta as our platform. And for other sensitive data areas, we're instrumenting two-factor authentication against those. So, a lot of what the question was about is really your security strategy moving forward and how you provide authentication, authorization, and policy-based and user-based driven access across all of your assets. And whether you're working remote or you're in-house, that doesn't really change from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, so same sentiment. We're two-factor for all of our regulated critical mission applications and all those things. We are looking though to enhance that in some certain cases, with tools like voice signature, like voice print and things of that nature. As you can imagine, with some of the fraud detection and tools and capabilities, we're always open to new ideas on how we can enhance the security posture. We're comfortable where we're at right now, but there's, this is something that you could always get better at. So we're always looking for opportunities there.
It seems like that's the predominant question list here, because I have one last question around security. In addition to GitHub, what are some other services critical to engineering work where security must be enforced? It seems like the whole, people with their laptops at home coding away with, the crown jewels.
Yeah.
Curious if there's any other areas that people should be thinking about.
If you're just checking security before you deploy code, then you've already failed. So security needs to be a first-class citizen when you're designing software within GitHub. You're checking security during your build process using, our build processes. We're moving to Jenkins right now. We use Bamboo, but there's security automation that needs to be built in there, and there needs to be security checks before you actually deploy the software, and a continuous security monitoring of when your code is actually running in production. So I would say it's design, build, test, and deploy are all areas where you should be, having security already built into how your software engineers are actually working today.
Yeah, so I would echo that. We have our engineers have to go through security training classes. They all know that this is part of their responsibility and their job as they're designing and developing new code. The only thing I would add to it is then in operations as well, as I mentioned earlier, before we deployed anything into the Amazon environment, we made sure that all the controls and security posture that we're comfortable with are in place. And we had to put in additional tools and additional process because not everything was there, right? And we had to fill the gaps to make it, so we were comfortable putting our applications, critical applications, in those environments. So it's a never-ending thing from a security process perspective. And we're a Jenkins shop as well. So, we've tried to build in, as I mentioned earlier, the launchpad that we created, some of those basic controls that you want to make sure that you don't give people an option to flick on or flick off. And then look at how we have the access controls in place once it's in production as well.
Well, I'll throw in one last plug then for Snyk, one of our portfolio companies, snyk.io, which I know both of you are familiar with. Yeah. But I think that one has a pretty good opportunity to span the lifecycle from open source to containers and cloud configuration. Well, with that, it's a wrap. I did have one polling question I wanted to ask. to see kind of how optimistic folks were about the economic recovery. Unfortunately, Dean and Marty, we can't answer this question, but let's see how folks are thinking here. I'll give it a good like 15, 20 seconds to see what the answer is. So far, beginning in Q1 of 2021, so basically we're going quarter from Q3, Q4 to Q2 next year. And right now, how the bulk of the answers are beginning in Q1 of 2021 with 42%, and beginning in Q2 of 2021 at 43%. So it looks like folks think that things will take a little bit longer. But once again, I just want to take the time, Dean and Marty. I missed some of our events that we've done together in person, but I really appreciate you spending the time and sharing with this audience just how you're thinking about the world and what your respective organizations are doing and continue to innovate, which I think is the most important thing ever, is that most folks think that just because we're going through some tough times that innovation stops, but even the Fortune 500s in New York are innovating like crazy. And I wanted to thank both of you.
Oh, thank you.
My pleasure, Ed. Thanks for having us.
Yep.
Awesome.
Everybody be
Right.
safe.
I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us, to all of the attendees. Thank you again to Marty and Dean, and we look forward to hosting you all at our next Boldstart CXO Connect. Please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, Boldstart VC, and on our website you can sign up for our newsletter at www.boldstart.vc. Thank you all very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Take care. Be safe.
Thanks, guys.
All right. You too.